moving figure, and he's a soldier in repose. You can see his rifle is turned down, yeah, and he's resting his hands on the butt of his rifle, and he has his head bowed. And he is looking in the direction from which the gas came at the Canadian lines and towards them here. Okay? So again, we have the Canadians here, and over there we have the French troops, and they start fleeing the first gas that is released, and so the Canadians have to fill the gap. And they've peed on their handkerchiefs or their socks or any piece of cloth, and they hold it over their mouths, and the urea in the urine neutralizes the chlorine gas. This is why later we get respirators, but they don't have respirators yet because this is the first time chemical warfare is used on the Western Front. So the Canadians fill the gap and they hold the line, and of course they've suffered quite a few casualties. And 2 days later, the Germans weren't sure how their gas was going to work, so they didn't exploit that opportunity, because they could have come crashing through those lines, because again they were weakly held, but they didn't exploit it because this was the first time they had used gas and they weren't sure how that was going to work. And so they actually stayed quite far behind the gas cloud themselves because they didn't want it to turn around and blow back on them. So they didn't exploit that opportunity. 2 days later, they released the gas again, and then because they had seen the effects that it had 2 days before that, they started advancing toward the Canadian lines. And the Canadians held, and they repulsed the attack. And in that, they suffered around 2,000 casualties. I read At the Sharp End by Tim Cook, and it talks about Currie, and even if you read The Madman and the Butcher by Tim Cook, talks about that attack and how Currie reacted, right? Because he's the commander of the 1st Canadian Division. And he went back. We went looking for reinforcements. No one was sending any reinforcements to him. Communications were broken down, and he went back to find reinforcements. And he'd been out. He went out to the front as close as he dared, and he came back completely in mud. He had called for Turner from the 2nd Division to send people up, and nobody was really helping him. He finally went back and saw Snow, who was commander of that particular army that was fighting in here, and he demanded that they do something. And he didn't get a lot of help right away, but eventually they did get reinforcements, and they were able to relieve the 1st Canadian Divisions, and they lived to fight another day. But the panic that would have sent in, and then again, I don't think the soldiers really understood what a great commander they had in Arthur Currie, because he was willing to go right up to the front. At Passchendaele, when he got there, and he was given the list of the weapons and guns that he was supposed to have behind the lines to take over from the Australians, he went to survey where those were, and half of the guns were not existent anymore. They had half sunk down into the mud, and he refused to move his troops into an attack until he could lay all the preparations necessary. And that meant that they had to do a lot of logistics. They had to build lots of these duck boards and lay them across between the lips of the craters to try and keep some stable ground and try to get these guns up. I don't know if any of you have seen the movie War Horse. If you haven't, I don't know what to tell you. I will never watch it again because it was too much. I can't stand seeing animals get hurt. But the horses, they would have died by the thousands here trying to bring up guns through the mud from exhaustion. And they couldn't be buried properly. They were just thrown to the side, and new horses or mules were brought in. So, you know, it was a huge logistical effort that went into that. But Currie refused to attack until all of those logistics were laid down. So it just goes to show he learned a lot from his time working with the divisions, and he took all of those lessons and reapplied them to make sure that the Canadians never lost another battle and suffered as few casualties as possible. He demanded always more guns. He wanted more firepower so that the infantry would have an easier time. Working with the creeping barrage and using these set-piece battles and using his artillery creatively, he actually was able to save a lot more lives than probably would have if he hadn't been so creative and if they had stuck to the old doctrines that they had learned in school. But this is a different war. So this is why I love Currie, because he was very good.